I would like to welcome you all to the third lunch talk in this series of lunch talks on transport after COVID-19. Before I will pass the floor to my esteemed colleague, Veronique, I will briefly highlight some important other events that will take place in the nearby future, most noticeably the Transport Research Days, which will be held on May 27 and 28. Normally it was in Delft, but it will be organized completely online. You see on this slide a snapshot of the start of the program, where this snapshot is also indicated on the BIVEC website. So you can already have a look at the program, and the join links that you see here are the different URLs to join the meetings of the different sessions during the BIVEC-GIBET conference. So I invite you all to participate and make it an interesting conference. You will also notice that Professor Van Wee also foresaw a coffee and tea corner. So during the breaks, as you could see on this slide, there will be also one room dedicated for more informal talks, that also the networking that is typically taking place in a conference also can take place during the BIVEC-GIBET Transport Research Days. So the website, for those who were not familiar, I indicate the URL again. And I also would already like to give a sneak preview to the next lunch talk, which will be held on May 21, in which Hannah Hoek from Ghent University will tell us more about undirected travel. With this presentation, I am happy to pass the floor to Veronique for her talk.
Okay, thank you, Mario. Let me see if I can share my screen properly. I hope I'm selecting the right one. Can you see already my screen?
Yes,
my
I see your screen, but not yet in full screen.
Okay. So now it should work or not?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Mario. It's my pleasure to talk about research that we recently done about the impact of COVID-19 on activity and travel behavior here in Luxembourg. And I think, I will touch upon several topics that will also be giving some input for the upcoming lunch talks. So I will touch upon several topics that will probably be dealt more into depth by some of our colleagues in the Benelux. So a short outline for today. So I will start with saying a little bit about the situation in Luxembourg so that you can compare it maybe with your numbers in Belgium, Netherlands, or wherever you are from and attending this lunch talk. Secondly, I'll present the SAY project. So that's a project for which we received some funding from our national funding agency and to organize a survey about the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 in Luxembourg. Then finally, most interesting part, the results. I will touch upon 4 topics. So first of all, what you might expect from the title of this presentation. What was the impact on daily out-of-home activities and travel behavior? A second subtopic is about the interplay, substitution, compensation between physical and digital activities. Third topic, something about teleworking. Many of us have experienced this in a very extreme way now, going from maybe teleworking a couple of times a week to almost working from home the entire week. So what's the impact on teleworking and commuting? And then finally, something about attitudes that might have changed towards mobility and also being in public space. And finally, some conclusions. So here are the numbers for Luxembourg. It sounds a little bit like Eurovision contest, but everybody, the past few months, the past year, we were overwhelmed by statistics like this. So this is for Luxembourg, the number of hospitalizations, how it started, end of March until now. The blue line is the number of persons in regular care, and then the red line are the number of persons in intensive care. And there you clearly see the different peaks. The first peak in springtime. So this one, when we were all talking about flattening the curve. We had a second smaller peak over the summertime. You could relate it to, well, some people would relate it to people traveling again, but this is already happening in end of July, August. So it's not really after the end of the summer holidays. It's already during the summer holidays. And you should know that in Luxembourg, the summer holidays for schools, they end mid of September. So mid of September, then you are somewhere here on the graph. So there you see that the graph was already going down again. Then our bigger, if you don't take this as another peak, our bigger second peak was at the end of the fall, beginning of the winter time. And this is the situation today. The graph is luckily going down again. So this is the third peak, a little bit smaller than the previous two ones. The number of people in intensive care, some people use this graph to say something about how serious the situation is and if your hospitals can cope with it. I think you need to put things a little bit into perspective. If you take the y-axis, you see the number of people. We are talking about maybe 200 people in hospitals all over Luxembourg in regular care. And then another 40 people, a little bit more in intensive care. Of course, Luxembourg, it's not as big as Belgium and the Netherlands. So that's why I put a little bit of numbers at the right side of this slide. So in terms of population, we have a population of 630,000 more or less, which is much smaller, of course, than Belgium and the Netherlands. But if you then have a look at the health sector in Luxembourg, you see that in terms of the number of doctors per 1,000 inhabitants, we are doing, we are at the same level as Belgium. Netherlands are performing much better in that respect. But if you then look at the percentage or the share of your employment in healthcare, Luxembourg, the number of jobs in other sectors are much larger compared to healthcare. And there you see that Luxembourg is underperforming compared to Belgium and especially the Netherlands. It depends on the definition that you use. Some sources talk about 9 hospitals in Luxembourg with a capacity of beds in intensive care around 130. So that puts things a little bit into perspective, but here it really depends on the definitions you use. I remember being also having a second residence in Belgium. I was also following the news a little bit in Belgium, and I remember there everybody was talking about we should get the number below a line of 500 people. We didn't have this type of discussions in Luxembourg, and this might be because of this capacity that we had. Now, a little bit background information about the safety measures we had. So it all started end of February. So the last day of February, that was when the first case of COVID-19 was detected in Luxembourg. And then, a few days after, there were a couple of new infections. And then suddenly, first week of March, there was a really fast growth in the number of positive cases, which led the government to decide that to implement the first lockdown on March 15. And that meant that Luxembourg never closed its borders. So it was always France, Belgium, Germany that closed the borders. Luxembourg never did this because cross-border mobility is also a big part for Luxembourg. We have many people that live in France, Belgium, Germany that cross the border on a daily basis to go to Luxembourg to work here. So if you would close the borders, it would become very difficult to organize our employment efficiently. It meant also that all non-essential shops were closed, only food shops were open, banks, post office, and something like pet supply shops, they were still allowed to open, but all the other shops were closed. Schools were closed, university went online. People were encouraged to work from home as much as possible. Construction sector was also closed for some time. So you really saw that life came to a standstill. You could not invite any people at your home. Outside gatherings were, I can't remember now if it was completely forbidden at the beginning or really limited to a couple of people. What else? Public transport was still running. So the services, there was not such a huge reduction as compared to other areas. There was some reduction in the weekends because of the low demand, probably. Maybe one restriction was that you could not enter a bus, for example, at the front door. You could only get on the bus at the rear, just to avoid contact between the driver and the passengers. And there were also some signs in buses where to sit, and you could not sit on the first row, for example. So that was a situation in March. In April 20, the construction sector could restart again. And then the first gradually lifting of safety measures took place from end May, when mid-May with the reopening of the schools, and then end of May, there was a gradually easing of all the other safety measures. So for example, 27th of May, bars and restaurants could reopen again, but only the outdoor space. So there you see it was built up gradually to come back to a new normal situation. You see that the curve, intensive care, was indeed flat for quite some time, but then you see this bump in the number of hospitalizations over the summer holidays. Now then in fall and near the winter time, you see this peak again, the second peak, which led to a second lockdown, much not so strict as the first one. So we talk about a partial lockdown. For example, there was a curfew implemented. You could not be outside between 11 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning. And this curfew was then also restricted over the holidays at the end of the year. So from December 26th, curfew was restricted to 9 p.m. until 6 p.m. Unless you had a dog, you could walk your dog outside these hours. And then January 11th, leisure facilities were reopened again. So that means gyms, swimming pools, musea. From their second lockdown, they could reopen again. And now from beginning of April, our restaurants, bars are open again. So that's a little bit sooner compared to the situation in Belgium and Netherlands. But again, only the outdoor space is open and only between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. At 6 p.m., everything should be closed again. So that's a little bit the situation today. So many of us are still working from home, but in a hybrid way, sometimes going back to the office. All shops, all services are open, so there's no restriction there. The only thing is that the HoReCa is not working completely at full capacity yet. So that's a little bit of context. Now, of course, in March, when we saw this pandemic happening, as a researcher, you think, of course, oh, this is now an ideal situation to do research about what's the impact on mobility. Also, will people develop new habits? What will it mean for sustainable mobility? So as a researcher, you think, oh, this is now really a nice, between brackets, situation to collect data and to do all sorts of analysis. Our national funding agency also launched a special call for COVID-19 projects, a fast track program, for which we also submitted, of course, something together with people from the university. So this is a project, the SAY project, it's about, the title was Socioeconomic Impacts of COVID-19, Collecting the Data. So it was a project really focused on just collecting data, organizing a large-scale survey about all kinds of socioeconomic topics. So it's not only about mobility. It's a collaboration between all the departments at Liser. So at Liser, at my institute, we have a department on urban development and mobility, in which I'm also working, but also two other departments about living conditions and about labor markets. So all the colleagues across these 3 departments started working together on this proposal, together with also a couple of researchers from the university, especially in mental health and the impact on time use and household interactions. The initial idea was that we would organize 3 waves of data collection by an online survey. And yeah, we didn't know at that time how the pandemic would evolve. We thought there will be a first wave with a first peak, then we will recover from this peak, that's the second wave, and then everything will be normal again, and that's our post-pandemic phase. Now, by now we know all this is way too optimistic. So the current status, while we were preparing our questionnaire in April, by the time we were ready to launch the survey, it was already mid-May. And if you remember well from the previous slide, mid-May, the government in Luxembourg was already announcing the first easing of the safety measures. So because our survey wanted to see what's the impact on people's behavior during the lockdown, but also after the lockdown, we had to quickly revise some of our questions and actually combine, our initial ID. We had to combine the ID of wave 1 and wave 2 into one, survey questionnaire that was covering the peak and the post-peak phase. That questionnaire was launched 27th of May, so at the time of the reopening of restaurants and bars in Luxembourg, and was open until beginning of July. We closed it at the 5th of July because if we would keep it longer, if we would have kept it open for longer, then we would go into the summer holidays when people are traveling again or not working, not in their regular routines. So that would have blurred a little bit responses, especially on topics like time use. So we wanted to avoid that. So that's the first wave, and I will be presenting some results of that first wave. At this moment, we are actually collecting, we are repeating the survey and we are collecting data again. So that's now our new second wave, the second peak, or now already the third peak. We started recontacting some of the respondents from the first wave, and we also launched a new data collection. So we will be able to link responses from the first wave to the second wave and really track the impact of COVID-19 on, for example, mobility of a selection of respondents throughout the year. And then we can also compare at a more aggregated level the wave 1 with wave 2. And we still have the idea to repeat it when we are really back into a normal situation. So that's our post-pandemic. But we don't know when that will happen. That's something that we've learned already. We might probably want to repeat our questionnaire a couple of times before we are really in the post-pandemic phase. Now, the survey itself, because there were so many colleagues working on this project, coming from different backgrounds with different interests, the discussions, the very first discussions was about how are we going to organize a survey. We had interest in topics like mobility, but also on the impact on employment, the impact on all kinds of living conditions, the impact on mental health, physical health, the impact on time use, household interactions. So you saw there was a variety of topics, and we were thinking, should we organize a series of surveys? But then we would need to organize maybe 6 surveys, or is there a possibility to integrate all these topics into one big survey? So we went for the second option because we thought organizing a series of surveys, then people would get tired of filling out these surveys. You should should remember that the number of inhabitants, 630 persons, it's not that high, of course. People are overwhelmed by requests to fill out surveys, and we noticed also in other projects that sometimes the willingness to participate in research can get quite low, and that's just because of the small sample size we have here, or the small population. So we decided to go for the second option and try to see how can we combine all these topics in one big survey and launch one big survey. What we did is that you see here now the structure of our questionnaire. So all the respondents started with questions about household and personal characteristics, so the basic background questions. And then at the end of this section, respondents were assigned randomly to one of the three bigger modules. So there was 1/3 of the respondents that replied to a questionnaire about work and living conditions. And this was a quite long questionnaire already, so there it stopped after the completion of module C. Another third was assigned to a module on daily activities and mobility, and that's the one that I will be talking about today. And then the other third went to a module E about health and health behaviors. Now, module D and E were a little bit shorter in number of questions compared to module C. So there we still had room to add a submodule about household interactions. And that subset, module F we call it, was only presented to people who are in a relationship. So single persons, the questions were not relevant for them. So single persons didn't see submodule F. So that's a little bit the structure of the data set or the questionnaire that we have. Now, how the questionnaire was distributed, it was targeting all residents in Luxembourg, but also cross-border commuters, can be for work, can be for school, and we focus on people aged above 16 years. It was an online survey, and yeah, because it needed to go quickly, we couldn't do first a stratified sampling and so on. That would have delayed things even more. So we went for an online survey. Liser did the press release, which was picked up by some journals and newspapers. We also used our social media, so Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, but we also did a targeted Facebook campaign. So we bought Facebook clicks. You can monitor a little bit where your ad is being presented, in which region, in which age group, is it among female, male? That's something that you can monitor a little bit. And then a third way was also contacting the municipalities in Luxembourg and asking them, hey, can you also put our survey on your website or on your own Facebook page? And many municipalities also were willing to do this. In such a way, we collected for the entire questionnaire, I think it was more than 7,000 responses, but after data cleaning, many of them were not very useful. So after data cleaning, we still had, I think, around 4,500 respondents. But then, of course, because not everybody is filling out all these modules, you need to have a look per module. And for module D, we have a sample size of around a little bit more than 1,000 respondents. Majority are people, residents from Luxembourg. So you see 84% are residents and only 16% are cross-border commuters. It was really difficult to distribute this questionnaire among the cross-border commuters. Okay. Sample composition, if you look at the descriptives, and this applies for the whole sample also, but for module D, you see some numbers specifically for module D. We have an overrepresentation of women. More than 70% are women. Highly educated are also overrepresented, and people in employment. Average age is around 45 years old. So yeah, you see the typical image here of our typical respondent. We were able to calculate weights, but only for the Luxembourgish residents. So the results that I will be presenting today are also weighted results. But you should then also keep in mind that it's only results specifically for the residents. And we corrected or we calculated weights in terms of age and gender. So these two aspects were recalibrated. Other aspects we couldn't do yet. Now, module D, daily activities and mobility. What are the topics? You see actually the same 4 topics that I will be using or referring to in this presentation. what will I be talking about? I will present some descriptive statistics by each of these 4 topics. I will also show you some of the change variables, I call it change variables, that we've created. So the questionnaire included questions about what was your situation in February, so just before the pandemic. What did you do in April, which was around the peak of the pandemic, of the first peak, the first lockdown, and what are you doing at the moment when you complete the survey? So that was end of May until July, let's call it June. So you can compare questions for June with February, or questions for April with February, and see how people have changed their travel behavior, their activity behavior. I will also focus on socioeconomic differences in these descriptive statistics and these change variables. For each of the topics that I will be discussing, we have calculated socioeconomic differences in terms of age, car ownership, presence of young children, education, employment status, gender, housing type, and that's if people lived in an apartment, yes or no, income, and marital status. I apologize for the background noise, but there is some construction going on in our street, and they are now really in front of our apartment. I'm not going to show slides for each of these variables on each topic, because that would take me way too long. I'm just going to highlight the most important ones. So what about changes in out-of-home activities? So in our questionnaire, we had a list of out-of-home activities, the ones that you see on the slide, and one in-home activity, if people were inviting people to their home. We asked them how many times did you do these activities per week. Answer categories were never less than once a week, 2 to 3 times a week, and then 4 or more times a week. So if we then compare the question for February with the question for April, it's not a surprise. We see a decrease in almost all of these activities. There was only one, go for a relaxing walk or bike ride, walking your dog, where you see that the majority, there's not really a change between April and February. At the same time, you see 30% has an increase, 20% said they decreased this type of activity. So in general, a huge decrease. And if you then calculate, making some assumptions, the weekly number of out-of-home activities, you see the graph on the right. What I did was making 3 bigger groups. So mandatory activities is go to your workplace, go shopping, services. Social visits is visiting family or friends and neighbors, and leisure are then the relaxing walk or bike ride, the practicing sports, and the other active leisure activities. So in February, if you make some assumptions and calculations, people had on average almost 12 out-of-home activities of this list, and this reduced to a little bit more than 6. So it's almost a halving of your daily out-of-home activities. Now you can have all kinds of discussions. If you don't go out your house anymore, what kind of social interactions do you have? What kind of participation and social life you still have? You see it has a huge reduction in participation in social life. Now, if you analyze the socioeconomic differences for this question, the most significant difference or the most strong difference was across gender. Of course, all people reduced many of their activities, but you see that the reduction is even larger for women. So I know it's a little bit a complicated graph, but you see all the activities and then 2 bars for men, women. You see almost for all activities that the red bar is a little bit larger for women compared to men. Maybe for work it's not that obvious, but for example, shopping. Suddenly men were doing the shopping and women reduced it. You see the increase is much larger for men than for women, and the decrease is just the opposite. So overall, we had the impression that women were actually now spending even more time at home, and maybe there is reinforcement of social inequalities from the past. So we see a little bit of these signs in our data as well. The only activity for which women increased their participation more was actually go out for a relaxing walk or dog. So that was a walk or bike ride. So that was apparently for many women the only activity to get out of the house more than before. Now, of course, these changes, it also depends a little bit on what was your level of participation already in February. So that's an example of these change variables. So this one, the left one, is for go to your workplace. Of course, you have a part of our sample who is not employed, so they never went to their workplace. They're all in the same situation in April. But you see that the category never go to my workplace increased with more than 30%. And the biggest increase comes from people that were going to their workplace 4 or more times a week. So you saw that this lockdown, for many people, it was commuting on a daily basis to no commuting at all again. This can partly be explained by teleworking, but also partly by people who lost their jobs or who were in temporary unemployment. So for go to your workplace, you see this changes very dramatically. You see from almost every day to almost never. For other activities like the relaxing walk or bike ride, the change is much more mixed, much more varied. But this is important to keep in mind. Was a situation in February? Where did we start from? To understand a little bit what is a decrease. In some situations like working, the decrease is really going towards never doing your activity anymore. Changes in transport mode choice, that's also an important one probably. So for example, for go to your workplace, the majority in February is using the car, 25% is using public transport. And from a sustainable mobility perspective, you want to know a little bit more about these people in public transport. In April, are they still using public transport, or did they shift towards other modes? So April, that's still the first lockdown in Luxembourg. You see the public transport users, many of them were not doing this activity in April. So they were not working in April, meaning they were working at home or in unemployment. But you also see two smaller bars, one that is going from public transport to public transport. So people that remained in public transport. But this small bar is actually smaller than the bar that's going towards cars. So there was indeed a shift from former public transport users that shifted towards car use during the lockdown to commute to work. Now the question is this because of a fear of being in public transport? We will see later in the presentation it's partly true, but there might also be another explanation. By many of these former car users were also working at home, so there was probably less congestion also on the roads, leaving these former public transport users the opportunity to use maybe the car from their partner to commute to work, because the car is available in your household now and there is less congestion. So that might also explain why people maybe temporarily shifted towards car use. So be a little bit careful with the explanation here. This is now the same graph, but a comparison between February and June. So that was in a situation when many safety measures were cancelled, were stopped, and people had a feeling to go a little bit more towards their normal life again. The question was a little bit different. So for the situation in June, the question was only shown to people who were teleworking in April. So the sample sizes are a little bit different compared to the slide before. So for people who were teleworking in April, you see their transport mode choice in February. So you see a little bit that among teleworkers in April, the share of public transport use is a little bit higher. So this suggests a little bit that, changes in public transport use and why public transport might not be at the same level today as before. It might also be partly explained by the fact that, there are still many people working from home. It depends on which, type of sector you work, which type of work you do. And there is some association between these aspects and also commute mode choice. So the typical teleworker might also be the public transport user from before. Now, what about the situation in June? In June, still, there's still a share of public transport users that are still working from home, but this percentage is a little bit lower compared to the situation in April. So it's going down. Many people are returning back to the office. The former public transport users, there's still a big share again in public transport, but the more or less the same share also shifted towards car use. So yeah, it's something that we should keep an eye on in the long run. This is now just numbers until June 2020. With our new survey that we are currently doing, maybe we will have a better view on this. If this share about car use is still as high today as compared to our first survey. Now, for the ones that use public transport, the ones that, is there a question or no? The ones that are again using public transport to commute to work or even to school, in June we asked them the question, are you satisfied with your public transport use to go to school or to go to work in June 2020? We used one of these standardized validated scales of travel satisfaction, and that scale consists of some differential scales with two extremes. You have 6 emotions and then 9 evaluations. We calculated the average for each emotion, for each evaluation, and then the combined travel satisfaction scale, the overall travel satisfaction. You see that the commuters, they tend to be a little bit more satisfied with public transport in June 2020 compared to the students. So the dark red bars are usually have higher scores than the orange bars, which are referring to the students. But overall, most of these aspects are above the neutral category of 4. There are a few emotions like being bored, being tired, but that's maybe, not so much, has not so much to do with, a fear of being in public transport. Maybe then being worried or being confident is more important here. And you see this one is above the 4 point category. Now it's a little bit, you can question, you see the overall travel satisfaction 4.3 for commuters, 4.0 for students. Is this now a normal situation, yes or not? Or if would it be before COVID-19, would these scores have been higher? By accident, we actually did a survey in February 2020 in Luxembourg about public transport satisfaction and use, because the 1st of March, Luxembourg has implemented free public transport, and we wanted to do a before study to see what would be the impact of this policy on public transport satisfaction and use. And in that survey, we actually had the same question here. The same scale was used. And if we compare the averages of that survey with the one of this COVID-19 survey, we see that these averages are actually very close to each other. So it seems that there also in the public transport survey, this question was only asked to people who recently used public transport. And same as here in our COVID-19 survey, so only public transport users have answered this question. And you see that their experience is quite similar. So that's a little bit reassuring that we talk a lot about people are afraid of being in public transport, but the actual transport users, if you ask them about satisfaction, it doesn't seem to have changed a lot. It's very close to each other. Now, the final aspects about daily activity, there's something about travel distance and travel time as well in the survey. There again, you see a huge reduction in distances and times. So it shows a little bit how the activity space of people was very shrunk a lot, and it gives you an impression that people were spending more time in their local neighborhoods, which gives rise to this discussion of a 15-minute society. So here you see what's the impact for example, shopping. We ask questions about your most regular shop, for example, daily groceries. Same for practicing sports. And yeah, for some other activities, you see that the pattern is a little bit more, shows a little bit more variety than other activities. Now, what about substitution of these physical out-of-home activities with digital activities? Our questionnaire included a list of digital tools, and we asked, so we tried to create a digital activity for each of the out-of-home activities. So you see the list here. And we asked them again, how frequently do you use these digital tools per week? The same categories as the out-of-home activities. And no surprise, many of these digital activities, we saw for many people a huge increase. Teleworking, use of digital school platforms, business meetings via video conferencing like this one, online shopping, but especially for daily groceries, it increased a lot. For non-daily projects, it didn't change that much for the majority of the respondents, and so on. With the same type of assumptions as for our out-of-home activities, we created a graph on the right. So in February, on average, people had like 8 digital activities per week, and this increased to almost 12 in April during the lockdown. So again, a huge increase, but it seems that this increase is a little bit smaller compared to the decrease in out-of-home activities. So this suggests that, yeah, we shifted some out-of-home activities towards digital activities, but there is not like completely a substitution between both. And it's especially for these mandatory activities, work, school, businesses, that we see a huge increase in the weekly number of digital activities. Now, again, what are the most important socioeconomic differences? For digital activities, it's not so much gender, although there are also significant differences. It's more about, do you have small children in your household or not? And yeah, you see for households with small children, for many of these digital activities, especially these households that increase their digital activities. It might be caused by the effect of having children, especially the use of digital school platforms. That's not a surprise. It might, for other activities, be linked to your phase in life. Household with small children are usually also the one in employment at an active employment age. So that also explains why then teleworking, the increase in teleworking is a little bit higher for these households, the increase in video conferencing, and so on. Another very important socioeconomic difference, and this is a little bit, I think, more problematic, is the impact of education. We see that the increase of digital activities is especially large for people with a higher education. People with a lower education, for example, for teleworking, their increase is much smaller compared to the higher educated part of our sample. This can be explained to, in the type of job that you are doing. Education is often linked to the type of employment, type of job, the type of sector you are working in. So those are some explanations underlying this graph. But it becomes a little bit more problematic, for example, to the use of digital school platforms. Here you also see an important difference between lower and higher educated households or respondents. So it shows you that education, the use of digital tools, if you already are limited at the stage of going to school in your education, you keep on lagging behind in this digital evolution that we see in society. So this is really something to keep an eye on, and I think here there are recommendations to be made to policy. Now, third subtopic was teleworking, commuting. So one of the digital tools or the digital activities that we asked was teleworking, working from home. Here you see how it changed between February and April. So in February, many of our respondents, more than 3/4, said, I am never working from home. And I think I need to compare it with other countries, but I have the impression this is really high. And this reduced to 1/3 during the lockdown in April. And it completely shifted from never working in February from home until to 4 or more times a week in April during the lockdown. So they're almost half of our respondents who are in employment were working from home almost the entire week. So it shows a huge shift in our the way we work in Luxembourg, and now it needs to be seen what the future will be. Everybody is thinking, yeah, teleworking will have a huge increase. It might also be true for Luxembourg, but here in Luxembourg we also have many cross-border workers, and at the moment there are some legal tax-wise restrictions about the number of days per year you can work from home in the other country. During the lockdown, these regulations were always renegotiated, but I don't know what will happen in the future if these new regulations will remain or if they will go back to the situation as before. We asked people, did you miss the experience of commuting to work? So among the ones who were teleworking, we asked that question. Majority said, no, I don't miss it at all. The fact that I don't need to travel to work. But there are 1/3 of the teleworkers said, yeah, I missed some aspects of commuting, and 7% said I miss it a lot. And if you then ask the reasons, what do you miss? The majority says more than 50% clicked spending time alone. So people were asked the 3 most important aspects that you miss. So that's why you see that these percentages are not adding up to 100%. Most important, spending time alone. So it seems that it's the commuting time seems to be a transition between work and home. But there are also other aspects which are a little bit less in terms of percentages, but are getting close to the spending time alone. Now, it adds to the discussion about the positive utility of commuting. Many of our transport models try to minimize commuting time. From the rational utility perspective, commuting time should be considered as wasted time. But now, the previous slide showed that people sometimes like it, commuting time, because it gives you some time alone. So there is also some part of the commuting time that could be considered as positive. If you now see the socioeconomic differences in this, so I did not miss it compared to I missed some aspects of commuting to I missed it a lot. You see that there are some important socioeconomic differences. So older people tend to say, I don't miss it at all. Women also say, oh, it's finally some more time at home for me, maybe. There's also difference in relationships or partnership status. The income difference here, you see that the low incomes said, I don't miss it at all, but that's because we have only a few observations in here. So that's something to be ignored, this last bar. But you see some important differences across the population. Now, we also asked, okay, maybe you missed the act of commuting to work. But if you think about teleworking, working from home, are there any advantages or disadvantages? And here again, people could select the 3 most important aspects. And there was always the option, I do not see any advantage, or I do not see any disadvantage. And I do not see any disadvantage. That's actually the share of that is actually higher than the one I do not see any advantage. So at the moment of the survey in June 2020, it seemed that many people actually liked working from home to some extent. But if you then ask about advantages, it's mainly because I can combine it with other activities. I have more flexibility. I don't need to travel to work. So this is a little bit contradictory with the previous slide. I have more time. I save money. So it's about flexibility. It's about time. It's about saving money. If you take a look at the disadvantage, there is one thing that stands out, and that's the lack of social contact. So there will be, for the future, if teleworking becomes the norm, or if we move to a hybrid way of working, we still need to see how do you keep in touch with your colleagues, not only for work, but also for the social life that's part of also going to work. Now, finally, some attitudes. We also include some attitudinal questions. We asked, to which extent do you agree with the following statements? And some of these statements refer to what will be the impact on shared mobility. For example, I was afraid to get infected by others, and therefore I did not share any rides or any vehicle with others. You see that, yeah, there is some agreement among the population. But it's especially car owners that agree with this. So car owners were not actually willing to share a ride with somebody from their own household, for their family or friends or neighbors. So it's really at that end of the spectrum, the car owners who said, no, I'm not willing to share. The other statement was, I have used public transport less often than before to avoid crowded buses, trams, and or trains. And there the agreement is especially high among the non-car owners, so the other side of the spectrum. So if you already don't have a car, you probably rely on public transport. And there you see that some of these people say, yes, I agree that I avoided the use of public transport because I was afraid of it. So these numbers should be put in relationship to the previous slides that I showed you about changes in transport mode choice. Now, we all spend a lot of time at home, so we were interested in seeing how do people evaluate their home and their local neighborhoods. And for this, for example, now that I had to spend more time at home, I realized that my home is not suitable for this. Majority says, no, I don't agree with this. There's only one small part that says, I agree with this. And if you then take a look at socioeconomic differences, this is especially high for low-income groups. 62% of our low incomes agree with this. So they are in agreement or completely agreement, compared to only 13.1% of high income groups. So there you see, yeah, low incomes will probably be associated with different housing conditions, smaller houses, no gardens, less number of rooms. And that's something that we should also explore more in depth. The social inequalities in housing are related to this. Then a couple of statements about the fear of public spaces. You see the three different statements that could be linked to that. And what is interesting is that especially young adults and students seem to agree with this. It's something that I personally wouldn't have expected, but if young adults say, yeah, I was really afraid to be in crowded public places like shops, public parks, and I have avoided as much as possible. Yeah, we need to see what's the impact on their mental health, their social not exclusion, but social participation in life, and so on. And then the importance of the local neighborhoods. There were some statements about I'm satisfied with the amenities at walking distance, and I enjoyed walking or cycling around in my local neighborhood. People seem to be really in agreement with these statements, so it seems all positive here. We have now added spatial variables to our data set, so we can now also check how they perceived it with the objective characteristics of the neighborhood. But we haven't done this analysis yet. This is something for the near future. So very shortly, the main conclusions. So with our first wave, we can say a little bit about the impact of the first lockdown in spring 2020. It was really obvious that daily life came to a standstill with almost a halving of the weekly number of out-of-home activities and also shrinking of the daily activity spaces. It is compensated to some extent by an increase in digital activities, but only partly. Most important change is probably the increase in teleworking. There we need to see if this is now different compared to other countries. My impression is it's maybe larger. Teleworking is generally positively perceived. Multiple advantages are mentioned against one important disadvantage being the lack of social contact. Despite the advantages, there are still 4 out of 10 people who miss commuting to some extent, very largely or to only partially. And that's mainly because commuting gives people a transition between work and private life. Now working from home, sometimes you don't see the difference between the end of your work day and the start of your private life in the evening. Everything gets blurred again, the difference between weekdays and weekends. So that's something that HR departments really should take into account, how to organize the future of working. There is an important impact on public and shared mobility. There seems to be a return to public transport at that time of the survey, but it was only partial. And there's still the question, is it because of the fear of getting infected? Some people said it was true, but we need to do some more in-depth analysis to see how the interaction is with other variables, because we think some of the people who were still working from home were actually the former public transport users, and that's linked to the type of job that they do, the type of sector that they are employed in, and the locations where these jobs are located. They are typically in locations which are better served by public transport. There are some important differences among socioeconomic groups, especially for women, especially for lower and higher educated and lower and higher income groups, especially for young adults. There's also an impact of not owning a car, and if you own a car, if you're still willing to share it with others. So we have some impressions that maybe COVID-19 has amplified some of the existing social inequalities, and for the future we will need to see if this now persists, because that would be very bad, of course, and how we can return them again to continue on the path that we had before. And that's it for today. So thank you for your attention. The statistics that I described today, they are available in the report. And here you see the website where you can download this report.
Thank you very much, Veronique. So now it's time for some questions. So please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. We are with many people. So after this interesting presentation, I'm sure there are multiple questions. I see Philippe with a question.
Yes, hello. Hello everyone. Thank you a lot, Veronique, for the very interesting and useful presentation. I'm working especially on cycling at the moment, and we know that during COVID, cycling has evolved a lot, and it's interesting to know a bit why. What are drivers of this important growth? So I was trying to find some answers about it in the presentation, but it was difficult to find elements really to be able to explain that. I don't know if perhaps you can help me on that question, although I understand that it was not the focus of the survey. Yeah.
Well. Thank you. In our survey, we started with this list of out-of-home activities. Do you participate in these? Then there was a follow-up question, which transport mode do you use for these activities? So we have a little bit of information about cycling, or people that use their bikes to go to work, to go shopping, for all these out-of-home activities that we asked. And then there is this one activity, go for a relaxing walk or bike ride. So it's a mix of walking and biking. So you don't know exactly what they did. So we can see with this our survey a little bit of the changes in the walking, cycling, just for the fun of it. And we see an increase for some people. And I know everybody had the impression that everybody was cycling suddenly or walking suddenly, but it seems to be true only for a part of the population. At the same time, we also see another part that has decreased this type of activities. So it's really mixed. And it's also confirmed in another module, the module on health. They asked for physical health activities that you did. And they also saw that some people really increased their physical activities. So they started exercising, sporting, walking, cycling, because that was the only outdoor activity that you were allowed to do. But at the same time, there were also people who reduced it. So it's really mixed. It's It's not that everybody was out in the woods here walking and cycling, but yeah, it's indeed true. It's something that could be analyzed more in depth to see what is the profile of people who increased their walking, the ones that decreased it, and the ones that, yeah, did not change it. And what was the change? Is it something, an activity that you did only a couple of times before COVID-19, and now you do it on a daily basis? So that's a little bit things indeed that we need to do a little bit more research on. But on that note, I think the next lunch talk will present some information on a survey about this very topic. So Hannah Hoek from Ghent University, she did a survey about undirected travel. So that's the cycling, the walking that you do just for the fun of it. And she has some interesting results to talk about, but that will be for the next presentation. I think there you might find maybe more answers than in my presentation.
All right, thanks for the teaser.
Okay, you're welcome.
And Justin?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, Veronique. Thank you for this presentation and the nice visualization as well. I just have a very quick question regarding the cross-border workers. So all the results here are for the people living in Luxembourg. Do you think you have enough respondents to carry out the same kind of analysis for the cross-border workers?
Yeah, it's a little bit a tricky thing. We only have 16%. So from our 1,000 or so respondents, that means 160, 200 respondents from cross borders. So the sample size gets indeed smaller. And if you then split it up by questions and making these these socioeconomic differences, it can become very small sample size. That's one thing. Another thing is that yeah, we can, of course, treat cross borders as an entire group. So group the people from France, Germany, Belgium together and compare them with residents. The only difficulty that we have now is calculating these weights for these samples, because you need to have the national, compared with national statistics of these three countries also doesn't make sense, because cross borders, they are only coming from a part of Belgium, a part from Germany and France. So this complicates a little bit the analysis. And then the other thing is that, treating the cross borders as one big group, it also doesn't do justice, especially in this first lockdown when the measures sometimes differed between the three countries. So that's why I started with a short explanation about the situation in Luxembourg, so that you know a little bit what were the measures at play and how different are they from the other countries surrounding us. And we know that France was very strict. It was even more stricter than Luxembourg. There people had to fill out a form at the beginning of the first lockdown when they want to go out. They were only allowed to go out once a day in a very short distance around their house for one activity during 1 hour a day. That has a totally different impact on your daily activities and mobility behavior compared to the situation we had here in Luxembourg. And in Belgium and in Germany. So there, I think it's a little bit tricky sometimes to do this comparison. Now, for the second wave of data collection, we will need to wait and see how many cross-border workers we have in there. It might be a little bit more higher because now we were able to involve one of the bigger platforms for cross-border workers, Les Transfrontaliers. We were able to get in touch with this organization, and they were willing to distribute the survey to their members. And that's one of the bigger associations representing cross-border workers. So yeah, it's a typical situation for Luxembourg, of course, and I can understand your question for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marketa?
Hello, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I wonder whether you have found any difference in the fear of getting infected between different classes of users. So more specifically, whether public transport users are more afraid of getting infected than car users. So whether people take their actual risk into consideration.
Yeah, it's something that we have not done yet. It's a little bit a shame to confess this. So at this moment was just the basic socioeconomic demographic characteristics. Car ownership is one of them. And yeah, all of these socioeconomic variables, they had significant differences. I only presented the most important ones. It's indeed true that we need to relate it to what was your commute mode choice for going to work in February, and does this have an impact on being afraid? My personal feeling here is that it might be that the car users are indeed afraid to get into public transport, and maybe not so much the public transport users themselves. But that's something that I cannot put on paper yet because we didn't test it formally. But when I was calculating some of the cross steps, I saw some signs going into that direction.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Anybody else having some questions? In the meanwhile, I still have one that relates to the mental health and the fact that you had the social impact that was indicated as the most negative aspect of teleworking. Is there any direction that you might mingle a little bit the different chunks of the questionnaire, that you also have an impact on the mental health aspect?
Yeah, that's something that we want to explore more in the upcoming months to see if that's possible. We don't have respondents that participated in this module that I presented today and the module about health, and there we had questions about mental health. So we cannot do it at a disaggregated level, but I think we still can do it at a more aggregated level. If you calculate the number of out-of-home activities for men and women, and then compare it with the average mental health items that we have in the health section, and see if there is some kind of correlation, I think that's something that we can do, but we cannot do it on a disaggregated level, unfortunately. What we can do, and we still have respondents that started with our daily activities mobility questionnaire or part. And then the ones who are in a relationship, we ask them also questions about time use. And there we have in-home activities and the interaction between partners and who was taking care of children and so on. That's something that we can do, but there we don't have questions about, and were you now satisfied and happy? And so the specific aspects of mental health are lacking there. But you see a little bit of a link between these out-of-home activities and changes in there, and then changes in your in-home activities. And that's something that we were working on the past few weeks. So we did some cluster analysis for the out-of-home activities, some cluster analysis of the in-home activities. And now we need to see if there is some correlation between these two. But that's also a work in progress.
Okay, I see a question from Michiel.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering, you have public transport as a whole. Do you also have data on, did you ask respondents, do you take the bus, tram, or a train?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have that. That's indeed, okay. At one point you need to decide to which detail you formulate your questions, and we had to group bus, tram, and metro. Bus, tram, and train. In Luxembourg, we have one tram line in Luxembourg City, and that's it. And then the other public transport modes are buses and trains. So in this survey, we don't have that. In the survey that I quickly mentioned that we did in February about public transport satisfaction and use, so before COVID-19, we did have this distinction. So if you want to know more about this distinction, then I think there's now a new call for new projects. If you would want to do something specifically for public transport, I think that's indeed something that we need to take into account, this difference between the two. I don't have it here for this COVID-19 survey. I know Koos Fransen, so now I'm also making some promotion for another BIVEC Lunch Talk. I think that's the 5th one, later in June, I think. He will be talking about the dependency on public transport during the lockdown, and maybe he has more insights into differences between buses and train systems.
Any remaining question? If not, then I think the moment is there to applaud Veronique for a very nice presentation, and I look forward to see you all in one of the coming events, in either the lunch talk of Anna Hoek or the BIVEC-GIBET Transport Research Days. So let's all thank Veronique for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. My pleasure.